I'll never forget the day the lockdown began. The world outside my apartment shrank into nothingness, replaced by an eerie, suffocating stillness. The news was relentless: death tolls, hospitals overflowing, desperation in every headline. But what haunted me most wasn't the virus. It was what I heard through the walls of my building. I live in an old apartment complex in the city, the kind where the walls are so thin you can hear your neighbors arguing, laughing, living. During the lockdown, the usual sounds of life faded. No footsteps in the hallway, no laughter seeping through the vents. Just silence. At first, I found comfort in the quiet. It felt like a break from the chaos. But then one night, I started hearing something strange. It began around 2 a.m., a faint tapping, like knuckles gently rapping against a wooden surface. I thought it was a neighbor trying to get someone's attention. But as the nights went on, the tapping became more rhythmic, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. It seemed to follow a pattern like Morse code. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing more than a leaky pipe or an old radiator. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. On the fifth night, curiosity got the better of me. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from the apartment next door, the one that belonged to Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter was a widow in her 60s, a quiet woman who always wore a knitted shawl, even in summer. We weren't close, but we'd exchanged polite nods in the hallway. Since the lockdown started, I hadn't seen or heard from her. The tapping continued every night, always at the same time. I began to lose sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. Was she trying to signal for help? Was she trapped or injured? On the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check on her. The hallway was darker than usual, the overhead light flickering faintly. When I reached her door, I hesitated. What if she was sick? What if I was exposing myself to the virus? I knocked softly. Mrs. Carter? Are you okay? No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Mrs. Carter, it's me, Sarah from next door. I've been hearing noises. Are you all right? Still nothing. A cold dread settled over me. I tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. Pushing the door open, I was hit by a wave of stale air, thick and suffocating. The apartment was dark, except for the faint glow of a TV screen in the corner. Static hissed from the speakers, the signal long gone. Mrs. Carter? My voice trembled. The living room was empty, the furniture neatly arranged, untouched. But then I noticed something, scratches on the wall. Deep, jagged marks running vertically, as if someone had clawed at it in desperation. The tapping started again. It was coming from the bedroom. My heart pounded as I approached the closed door. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, echoing in the silence. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room was cold, the air thick with the scent of mildew. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled. And there, sitting on the floor by the far wall, was Mrs. Carter. Her back was to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. She was tapping on the wall with her fingertips, the motion jerky and mechanical. Mrs. Carter? I whispered. She stopped. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. But it was her smile that sent a jolt of terror through me, wide and unnatural, as if it had been carved into her face. You heard me, she said, her voice a rasp. You came. I stumbled backward, my flashlight slipping from my grasp. They don't like when you hear them, she whispered, her eyes flicking to the wall. Before I could respond, the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from her. It was coming from inside the wall. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, the door locked and bolted behind me. The tapping continued for hours, louder and louder, until it felt like the walls would collapse under the weight of the sound. The next morning, I called the building manager. I told him everything, begged him to check on her. When they finally entered her apartment, it was empty. No sign of Mrs. Carter. No scratches on the walls. No evidence she had ever been there. But the tapping hasn't stopped. When the pandemic lockdown began, I thought the worst I'd face would be boredom. I live alone in a cramped studio apartment in a part of town where people mostly keep to themselves. The only view I had was of the crumbling, abandoned building across the street. Its windows were blacked out with grime, the walls tagged with graffiti, and its front doors boarded up with rotting wood. It was a dead building, lifeless and forgotten. Or so I thought. The first time I saw him, it was late at night. I'd been binging some show on my laptop, trying to drown out the anxiety that had been clawing at me since the lockdown started. I stretched, walked to the window for some fresh air, and glanced across the street. There, in one of the windows on the third floor, stood a man. He was barely visible, just a shadow against the dim light of the room behind him. His face was obscured, but his silhouette was clear, tall, with unnaturally long arms that hung at his sides. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, staring directly at my window. I froze. The building had been abandoned for years. There was no electricity, no reason anyone should be inside. I convinced myself it was my imagination or a trick of the light. Maybe someone had broken in to squat there. But when I looked again, he was gone. The next night, I couldn't stop myself from checking. It felt like some dark compulsion, an itch I couldn't scratch. I turned off my lights and peered through the blinds, trying to stay hidden. He was there again, in the same window. This time, he was closer to the glass, his head tilted slightly, as if he was studying me. My stomach churned as I realized something unsettling. There was no light in the room behind him. His figure was sharp against pure darkness. And then, slowly, he raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. I stumbled back, slamming the blinds shut. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was just some homeless guy trying to scare me. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The third night, I decided I wasn't going to let it scare me anymore. I stayed up, waiting for him to appear. Midnight came and went, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. At 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why aren't you looking?" My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as panic set in. My hands shook as I typed back. "Who is this?" No response. I couldn't resist. I walked to the window, lifted the blinds just a fraction, and peeked out. He was there. But this time, he wasn't in the window across the street. He was in mine. I stumbled back, knocking over a lamp. When I looked again, the window was empty, the street below silent and still. The next day, I called the police. I told them someone had been inside my apartment, that I'd seen him. They came, looked around, but found no signs of forced entry. I could tell they didn't believe me. After they left, I checked every lock, every corner, every crevice of my apartment. I even shoved furniture against the door. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself I was safe, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I stayed away from the window. I turned all the lights on and kept the TV playing in the background to drown out the silence. At 2:37 a.m., the power went out. My apartment was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to guide me. My hands trembled as I tried to call the power company, but before I could dial, my phone buzzed. "Turn around." I froze. The air in the room felt heavier, colder. Slowly, I turned, the dim light of my phone casting long shadows across the walls. He was standing in the corner, his face hidden in shadow, but his eyes were glowing. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning. The power was back, the apartment was as I'd left it, and there was no sign of him. But every night since, I've felt it, the weight of his gaze. I don't look out the window anymore. I keep the blinds shut and the lights on, but it doesn't matter. Because no matter where I go, I can feel him watching. The lockdown was isolating, but my phone was a lifeline. Text messages, video calls, social media. It was the only way to feel connected to the world. I spent most of my days scrolling, losing myself in endless feeds of bad news and comforting distractions. One evening, after yet another exhausting Zoom meeting for work, I collapsed onto my couch and checked my phone. A single notification blinked on my lock screen. "You have one unread message." I tapped it, expecting a text from a friend. Instead, it opened a blank screen. No sender, no content, just an empty void. I frowned, assuming it was some kind of glitch, and closed the app. The next day, it happened again. Same notification, same blank screen. I restarted my phone, deleted some apps, but nothing worked. I told myself it was just a bug, something to ignore. But the notifications kept coming. Each day, the message would appear at exactly 3:03 p.m. By the fifth day, I started feeling uneasy. There was no pattern, no source, no explanation. And every time I tried to dismiss it, I'd feel this strange, creeping sensation, like someone was standing just behind me. I started noticing other things too. My phone would buzz randomly, but when I checked, there were no notifications. My music app would open on its own, playing eerie, staticky sounds instead of my playlists. And then there was the camera. One night, while scrolling in bed, I noticed the tiny green dot at the top of my screen, the one that signals when the camera is in use. I wasn't on a video call, wasn't recording anything. I checked the app permissions, disabled everything that could access the camera, but the dot stayed on. I placed a piece of tape over the lens and tried to sleep. The next morning, the tape was gone. The next message came at 3:03 p.m., like always. But this time, when I opened it, there was text. "Look outside." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My curtains were drawn, blocking the view of the street below. My rational brain told me it was some kind of prank, a hacker messing with me. But I couldn't stop myself. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty, silent, as it had been since the lockdown began. But across the road, standing perfectly still beneath a flickering street lamp, was a figure. It was hard to make out any details, just a tall, shadowy shape. It wasn't moving, but I knew it was watching me. My phone buzzed again. Another message. "Wave." I stumbled back, my heart racing. I dropped the phone and grabbed my landline to call the police, but the line was dead. When I picked my phone up again, the screen was filled with static. Another message appeared. "Don't call them. Come closer." I turned off the phone and locked all the doors, my hands trembling. I spent the night huddled in my bedroom, every sound amplified in the silence. The next day, I checked my phone cautiously. No messages, no strange behavior. I almost convinced myself it was over. But then at 3:03 p.m., the screen lit up again. "We're inside now." I didn't dare look up. My heart pounded as I stared at the words. Slowly, almost involuntarily, my eyes drifted to the corner of the room. It was empty. Relief began to flood through me, until I noticed the mirror. In the reflection, there was someone standing behind me. Not a shadow, not a shape. It was me. Only it wasn't. The reflection smiled, a wide, toothy grin that didn't belong to my face. Then it raised its hand and waved. I screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. My phone buzzed again, breaking the silence. This time, the message wasn't words. It was a live video. Of me. In real time. But in the video, I wasn't sitting on the couch. I was standing behind myself, that same twisted grin on my face. Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was the sound of footsteps, getting closer.